I'm going to show you how to provision a mobility controller to a mobility master using zero-touch provisioning and Aruba Activate. So what I have in my lab here is a factory reset 7010 controller. Now I'm going to use the last port. I'm going to plug in, and this is going to get DHCP and DNS, and it's going to talk to Aruba Activate, and then Aruba Activate is going to tell it how to connect to the mobility master. When it connects to the mobility master, a new config will be pushed down, and when a new config is pushed down, my port 1 is going to be my trunk port. That's going to also, it's going to have my management VLAN as the native VLAN, but it's also going to have tagged VLANs for my wireless LAN ports will come down across this interface. So that's what we're using here in the lab, and there's a couple things that I need to show you to get started. So over here I have my notes. The first thing we need is we need to get into Aruba Activate. Once we're in Aruba Activate, we need to go to Devices, and we need to add in our mobility master and our controllers that we're going to zero-touch provision. So here's my 7010 controller, and this is my mobility master. Now, some people will tell you that you don't need to have your mobility master added in here. They say that all you need to do is go into your mobility master and go into the Activate settings and set up your username and password, and that will push the cert up into Activate. But I could not get that working until I added in my mobility master. Once I had this added in, everything started working perfectly. So if your mobility master is already online, you can go in and you can do the commands show activate activation key, and then you can come back and add your device, and this is where you would put in the activation key and the MAC address of your mobility controller. Now if you have a mobility master or even a new controller that you're booting up and you don't have that activation key because you're not into the GUI yet, what you can do when the controller is booting, you can go into debug mode. It will give you a menu when it's booting up in the very beginning. You can go into debug mode, and you will see the activation key come scrolling across, and that's the activation key that you can use to add it in here. So once you get your devices added into activation, into the Activate, then you need to go to Setup, and you need to make a provisioning rule. So to make a provisioning rule, if you don't have any, you'll just click on New, and you'll select a provision rule. And I'm going to cancel now. I just wanted to show you this, but let's go into my existing rule, and let's look at what one looks like. So you select provision rule after New, and I have no redundancy, but if you had layer 2 or layer 3 redundancy, see, it gives you additional options to fill in here for either a VPNC controller, so a VPN controller, or you know, and also for your backup controllers. Right now I have a simple configuration, and I found out that before I had my mobility master added in, nothing showed up in this drop-down box. I ended up typing things in and you know, saving it, and it kind of took them, but it really doesn't work. You need to make sure that your mobility master is first added in the Activate, and then it will show up in the drop-down list. So this is how you know that your mobility master is correctly in Activate. Then put in the IP address, and here I have my country code. So that's all you need for your provisioning rule. But notice in your provisioning rule, it does not give you anywhere where you can add in like a pre-shared key. So what I mean by that is, when you used to go into your mobility masters and you were going to set up a new controller, you would click on plus to add the controller here, and then I would typically use an IPsec key. I'd put in the IP address of the controller here, and then I would put in some key that I'm going to use on both ends, right? When I'm setting up the wizard on the controller, that's where I would add the key. Now, as I showed you in Activate, there's nowhere to add in a key. So what you're going to do is you're going to make a certificate-based key up here. And what it will use is it will use the MAC address of the controller and the mobility master. So on the mobility master, you're going to put certificate, and you're going to put in the MAC address of your controller. In my case, it's my 7010. And I'm going to select factory cert. Now I already have it, it's right here. But you have to add that in because that's how it will build the VPN tunnel. So let's click cancel on that. But that you want to take care of. And then you need to add in your controller. Now I already have a controller here, but I'm going to delete it out and we're going to start over because I want you to see that it's completely fresh and no configuration in here. So let's delete this out. Now, one thing I wanted to also point out is in Activate, here it's looking for the config node path. So it's MD for managed network and then /lab, because that's what I have here, my managed network and then lab. And this is where my controller is going to go. So I'm going to click on plus. I'm going to give the controller a name. So I'm just going to call it Aruba 7010. I'm going to paste in my MAC address for that controller. And I'm going to tell it it's a 7010. Now I'm going to click submit, hit pending changes. I'm going to deploy that. And now I'm going to highlight the controller, and there's a few things that I want to change on this controller. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to interfaces and I'm going to make VLANs. Now, the IP address of my controller is going to be 192.168.128.3, which is really in my VLAN 128. But it's untagged. So the port to this 7010 controller, if I bring it up here, the port to this 7010 controller, it's going to be a trunk port. But I'm going to make my native VLAN in 128 for management. One thing I found with the zero touch provisioning is you got to make it VLAN 4094 or it will give you headaches. It will connect and it's going to try to connect on VLAN 4094 and if you make the management 4094 untagged, you're not going to have any problems at all. So I recommend using that. So let me put my IP address on here. Again, this is really in my VLAN 128, but since it's untagged, it doesn't really matter because it's untagged on the switch port. So I'm going to click submit, and I'm going to make another VLAN up here, and I'm just going to call this my corp VLAN, and this is going to be, my VLAN is going to be 146. So when I highlight that, 146, now I'm going to put an IP address on it. And one other thing I want to do in this section is I want to set a route. So I make sure that I can get to my management interface. So I'm going to click on static route here, or my static default gateway. And I'm going to make it 128.1 and hit submit. Now I'm going to hit my pending changes here and deploy them. And there's one more section I need to go in here. I need to go into my system now. And this is where you need to set a password for the controller because it's a factory defaulted controller coming up. If you don't set a password, you won't be able to get in when it comes up. So here I'm setting the password. I'm going to hit submit. And now I'm going to go down here to my controller IP address. Now this is the management IP address on the controller. So I am going to select my VLAN 4094 and because that's the IP address I want, and I'm going to hit submit. Now the last thing I have to do is hit deploy these pending changes, and that pushed everything out. Now just to verify it, I'm going to go into my mobility master here, and we'll do a show configuration node hierarchy. Oops. And you can see it created my new path in here for my new controller. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cd to this device, and I'm going to do show configuration committed. And here you can see that it created my VLAN 146 and 4094. You can see that's my management network, and here's my IP address. So you can go in and you can configure all your wireless LANs. You can configure everything you want right now. And when I zero touch provision this will all come down. So that's all I really need to do at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to plug in the controller, and I'll speed it up in the video, but I'm just going to let this stay up on the screen so you can see it go out and speak to activate, and then it will come back and it will connect to my controller or to my mobility master, and it will pull down its config, and we'll go in and verify everything. But I'm going to plug it in now, and I'll speed up the video. Okay, so now it looks like it's up the controller. Let's see if it pulled its config yet. We'll hit refresh. Okay, so the mobility master doesn't seem to see it yet. We'll probably see down the bottom here it will start saying syncing config. So we'll just wait a little longer. So now it's going through the reboot process. It's Okay, so now we can see that the controller is fully booted. We have a login prompt. Let's see if the mobility master, the mobility master does see it. So it thinks it's up. So we can test to make sure that our password worked. Okay, so our password worked. You can also do a show switches. So you can see it says update required. So we'll wait a minute for the config to be pushed and synced. Okay, so now our config is updated. We can see that it has a tunnel built to the mobility master. We'll check the mobility master. Yep, so it sees it here. And then and it sees my tunnel here. And everything looks good. So what we could do, we could even try making a wireless LAN or making another VLAN to make sure it gets pushed out. So let me go into my controller. I'll go to my interfaces. I'll make a new VLAN. And you can see it created my new VLAN 100. So we're up and we're working good. What we could also do is, if you wanted to change it now that it's up, you could change it from certificate based. You could go in and add in a local pre-shared key, and then you could go here and you could change it on the controller also. So you could go in here and you could change it from certificate if you want it back to a pre-shared key. But that didn't take too long. You'll see that the configuration part on my end was very minimal, and we were able to zero touch provision this controller.